She was standing on the sidewalk outside the Greyhound station in the rain without an umbrella, and she had been standing there long enough that her coat was dark at the shoulders, and her white hair was flattened against her forehead, and she was not moving. Not pacing. Not checking a phone. Not looking up and down the street with the ordinary restlessness of someone waiting for a ride that was late. She was simply standing, with the stillness of a woman who had arrived at the end of the options she'd been able to think of, and was now waiting for something she couldn't name to tell her what came next. She held a single bag, a small canvas tote, the reusable kind from a grocery store, with 2 handles, and it hung at her side with a weight that suggested it held everything she had decided to bring. Titan was out of the truck before Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Holt had fully set the brake. Not scrambling, deliberate, the big German shepherd hit the pavement and turned left toward the woman without a single moment of hesitation, without sniffing the air or scanning the street or doing any of the things he did when a situation was still being assessed. He had already assessed it. He moved to her in a straight line, and when he reached her, he sat down beside her left leg, close enough that his shoulder pressed against the side of her knee, and he looked up at her face. And he did not move again. Marcus stood beside the open truck door in the rain and watched his dog make a decision he had not been given, and understood, the way he always understood when Titan got ahead of him, that something here required the kind of attention that could not be hurried. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. Because what Marcus learned about the woman standing in the rain, and what Titan had already understood the moment he saw her, will change how you look at the people you pass without stopping. We read every comment. We want to know how far this story travels. Marcus Holt was 43 years old, and the quality most people settled on when they tried to describe him later was composure, not coldness, not distance, but the specific composure of a man who had learned, through years of operating in environments where composure was the difference between outcomes, to carry the full weight of a situation without letting the weight show in his face or his voice or his hands. He was 6 feet and solidly built through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who had maintained physical conditions so long it had stopped being a choice and become a fact of how he existed in the world. With close-cropped dark hair that had gone silver at the temples sometime in the previous 2 years and that he had not thought about long enough to have feelings about. His jaw was squared and his eyes were a light, clear gray, the gray of early morning sky before the color fully arrives, and they moved through every space he entered with the methodical, unhurried sweep of a man taking inventory. Not because he was suspicious, but because attention was the reflex that service had built in him, and that civilian life had not dismantled. He was not a man who missed things. He was, on the other hand, a man who had sometimes not known what to do with what he saw. He was working on that. He had served 3 deployments with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Helmand Province in 2008, Sanjin in 2011, and a 3rd rotation through the Korengal Valley in 2014 that had lasted 8 months, and from which he had returned with a Navy Cross for an action during a casualty extraction under fire that he had described, in the brief formal language of the citation, as an act of valor, and that he himself described, when pressed, as what anyone there would have done. He had completed his service with a voluntary separation in 2017 at the end of his enlistment, driven by the calculation that he had given what he had to give in that particular form, and that continuing past the point where he could give it fully was its own kind of failure. He had come home to Cookeville, Tennessee, bought a small house on the edge of town, and spent the 2 years since doing private security consulting and relearning the particular skills of civilian life. Patience with slowness, tolerance for noise that wasn't a threat, the ability to sit in a room without knowing all the exits, with the same deliberate methodology he had applied to everything else. He was not unhappy. He was still calibrating. He had Titan, and Titan was the most honest instrument he owned. Titan was a 7-year-old German Shepherd, with a coat the color of dark sable, shifting to deep tan along the flanks and chest. Thick enough that the rain beat it on the outer layer without reaching his skin. He weighed 86 pounds and moved with the ground covering, low-slung economy of a dog trained for urban work. Quick in tight spaces, patient in open ones, capable of holding a position for longer than most people expected without any visible sign of the effort it cost. His left ear was notched at the outer tip from a fragment during a compound clearance in Sangin in 2011. A small, clean-cut healed to a pale V in the fur that Marcus had always thought made him look like a dog who had been in the room when the decision was made. He had been. He was always in the room when the decision was made. His amber eyes were the most expressive thing about him, not warm in the way domestic dogs are warm, but communicative, precise, transmitting assessments in a language Marcus had spent 7 years learning to read, and that he now read the way he read terrain, automatically, continuously, trusting the read before he trusted anything else. Titan had been with Marcus since Sangin. Getting him adopted through the military working dog program after separation had taken 6 months and 3 formal appeals and the assistance of a congressman's office, and Marcus had made all of it happen without complaint, because some things were not negotiable, and Titan was one of them. Cookeville in March smelled of wet pavement and the particular sweetness of Tennessee mud after rain, and the sky over the downtown block had been the flat, pressed gray of a low-pressure system that had been sitting over the Cumberland Plateau since Tuesday and showed no intention of moving. The Greyhound station sat on a side street off the main commercial strip, a small building with a covered entrance that offered a few feet of shelter from the rain and a row of plastic chairs inside that were occupied by 3 people who had no intention of giving one up. Marcus had been 2 blocks away picking up a part for the truck's alternator when Titan had stood up in the passenger seat with a single, deliberate movement that Marcus had learned to read as the behavioral equivalent of a tap on the shoulder. He had driven the 2 blocks without fully knowing why. Her name was Cecilia Marsh. She was 92 years old, and she had been born in Cookeville in 1933 and had left it at 19 and returned to it now for the first time in 73 years for the reason that people return to the places they started. Because the place they had been was no longer where they were, and the place they had started was the only coordinate they could still name with certainty. She had taken the bus from Louisville, 14 hours, with a connection in Nashville, and she had arrived at 7:40 that morning, and had been standing outside the station for 2 hours and 11 minutes, because the person who was supposed to meet her had not come, and she did not have a working phone. The phone her granddaughter had sent her 2 Christmases ago had died somewhere between Nashville and Cookeville, and she did not have the address she was going to written anywhere she could find, because she had kept it in the phone. She had 2 things in the canvas tote: a change of clothes and a photograph in a cardboard frame of a man in an army uniform she had loved for 41 years and buried in 1991, whose name was Bernard, and who had served in the Pacific Theater in 1944 and 1945, and come home with a story he never told, and a gentleness that people who met him afterward recognized as something forged rather than something natural, the kind of gentleness that costs something to build. She had carried the photograph since 1991. She had not once left it behind. Marcus crouched beside Titan, and then looked up at Cecilia. She was looking down at the dog with an expression that had shifted in the past 30 seconds from the set, enduring stillness of a woman at the end of her options to something that was not quite relief and not quite recognition, and was its own complete thing. The particular softening of a person who has been holding everything alone for a long time, and has just felt. for the first time in that long time, that they do not have to hold all of it right now. He won't leave, Marcus said. I can see that, Cecilia said. Can I help you find somewhere to be out of the rain? Marcus said. She looked at him with the clear, frank assessment of a woman who had been on this earth long enough to read people accurately on short acquaintance, and who had learned that the alternative, assuming the best without reading, was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. She looked at his face. She looked at the dog. She looked back at his face. I'm trying to reach my granddaughter, she said. I don't have the address. We can find it, he said. They found it in the dry cab of his truck with Titan between them on the bench seat. The granddaughter's name was April, and Marcus found her through a combination of the last name Cecilia remembered, the Cookeville directory, and a call to the main branch of the Putnam County Library, where a woman named Gloria answered and, when Marcus explained the situation, produced April Marsh's phone number from the local address file in 4 minutes, with the cheerful efficiency of a person who considers finding things for people to be the entire point of her job. April answered on the first ring, breathless, driving, already 40 minutes out of town when Cecilia had landed, and the bus had been early by 12 minutes, and the phone had died, and April had been circling the station for an hour, calling a number that no longer worked. She arrived 22 minutes later, and Marcus watched the reunion from the truck with Titan's head on his knee, Cecilia climbing carefully out of the cab, April coming across the parking lot at a pace that was too fast for dignity and not fast enough to be running. The two of them meeting at the front of the truck in the rain and holding each other with the complete, uncalculating intensity of people who had not been sure the moment was going to happen. He would have left then. He would have driven back to the alternator job and put the afternoon back together. But April, when she had collected herself enough to speak coherently, turned to him with Cecilia's hand in hers and said that she needed to tell him something, and asked if he had time. He had time. What April told him, in the parking lot of the Greyhound station in the rain, took 12 minutes and accounted for why Cecilia Marsh was arriving in Cookeville at 92 years old with a canvas tote bag and a photograph and nothing else. The apartment in Louisville where Cecilia had lived for 11 years had been managed by a company that had sold the building to a property group run by a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was 47 years old and ran a residential property acquisition operation out of Nashville that specialized in the purchase of older low-income apartment buildings in secondary cities, where the renovation and repositioning model produced the greatest margin. The model required vacancy. Vacancy in occupied buildings required tenants to leave. Voss's operation achieved this through a coordinated process that Cecilia's tenant advocacy organization had documented in 31 cases over 4 years, building maintenance complaints going unanswered for months, then cited as reasons for code violations, heat and hot water disruptions timed to winter months, rent increases issued on 30 days' notice to tenants on fixed income who could not absorb them, and, in the cases of elderly tenants living alone, a specific pattern of visits from building managers who suggested, gently and with apparent concern, that the building was no longer safe for residents of advanced age and that relocation assistance was available through a nonprofit partner whose relocation assistance resolved upon examination to a bus ticket to the city of the tenant's choosing. Cecilia had received her relocation visit 6 weeks ago. She had resisted for 3 weeks. The heat in her apartment had been off for 9 days before she had called April and told her she was coming to Cookeville. She had not told April the rest. She had not wanted April to carry it. She had been carrying things alone for so long that the habit was structural. Titan had been sitting beside Cecilia since she got out of the truck. He had not moved when April arrived, and he did not move now. He sat at Cecilia's left side in the rain, with his body angled slightly toward her, and his amber eyes tracking the parking lot with the steady, proprietorial attention of a dog that has appointed itself responsible for something and is not yet finished. Marcus called 3 people that evening. The first was a woman named Dana Reyes, a staff attorney at the Tennessee Fair Housing Council in Nashville, who was already aware of Harlan Voss's operation, had been tracking it for 22 months, in fact, and had filed 2 complaints with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission that were in various stages of review, and who said, when Marcus described Cecilia's situation in specific detail, that a documented personal account from a named tenant was exactly what the pattern evidence complaint had been missing, and that she would drive to Cookeville herself on Saturday if Cecilia was willing to speak. On the record, Cecilia, when April relayed this, said she had been waiting for someone to ask. The second call was to a former Marine named Cole Hatcher in Nashville, who had spent the decade since service working housing advocacy for veterans and elderly residents, and who knew. When Marcus described the relocation assistance nonprofit, exactly which entity Marcus was referring to, and had been building a parallel complaint with 3 other displaced tenants for the better part of a year. Cole said he would connect Dana Reyes with his case files by morning. The third call was to a reporter named James Tully at the Nashville Banner, who had covered predatory property practices in Tennessee for 5 years, and who said 2 words when Marcus finished. Say when. Harlan Voss's attorney called Marcus's cell phone the following Thursday. He was smooth and measured and said that his client was aware of certain inquiries and wanted to make clear that all of his client's operations were conducted within the applicable regulatory framework, and that any suggestion of targeted displacement of protected classes would be vigorously contested. He said his client was also prepared, as a gesture of goodwill, to extend a financial settlement offer to certain tenants who had experienced service disruptions. Marcus let him finish. "I'm going to tell you what's already in motion," Marcus said, "so you can give your client accurate information." He described, in the same sequence he had used in every briefing since 2008, what had been assembled: Dana Reyes's Tennessee Human Rights Commission complaint with Cecilia Marsh's account now attached as Exhibit 14, Cole Hatcher's consolidated filing representing 4 additional displaced tenants, including 2 other women over 85, the documentation connecting the relocation assistance nonprofit to a subsidiary of Voss's property group, and James Tully's article, which was scheduled to publish the following Tuesday, and which had been reviewed by the Banner's legal department and cleared for print. He said the Department of Justice's Fair Housing Division had been notified as a courtesy by Dana Reyes's organization that morning, which was a standard procedural step, and which Marcus mentioned not as a threat, but as a fact the attorney should have in order to advise his client accurately. He paused. Titan had been lying across Marcus's feet the entire call, his chin on the floor, his amber eyes open and tracking the room at ceiling level the way he tracked rooms when he was resting, but not fully resting, which was most of the time. "The settlement offer," Marcus said, "should go to Dana Reyes. She'll know what it needs to cover." The Tennessee Human Rights Commission issued a formal finding of discriminatory housing practices against Harlan Voss's property group 7 months later, following a period of investigation that incorporated the testimony of 11 displaced tenants across 3 cities. The finding carried a civil penalty of $460,000 and a mandatory corrective action plan requiring the property group to maintain habitable conditions in all occupied units and to cease the use of any third-party relocation referral services that could not demonstrate independence from Voss's ownership structure. The relocation assistance nonprofit was dissolved under a separate agreement with the state attorney general. James Tully's article ran as a 4-part series and was nominated for an investigative reporting award by the Tennessee Press Association. Harlan Voss retained his properties, but lost 2 institutional lenders who cited the Human Rights Commission finding in their termination letters. His attorney billed him, Donna Reyes estimated, at a rate that exceeded the regulatory penalties by a considerable margin. Cecilia Marsh did not return to Louisville. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Cookeville, 4 blocks from April, in a building managed by a family that had owned it for 30 years and whose maintenance response time Cecilia tested twice in the first month and found satisfactory. She had a window that faced south and caught afternoon light, and a small table by that window where she kept the photograph of Bernard in his uniform, which she had carried from Louisville in a canvas tote bag, and which now had a proper frame and proper light and sat the way things sit when they have finally arrived at the place they were always going. 5 months after the rain and the parking lot, Marcus drove the 4 blocks on a Sunday afternoon with Titan in the passenger seat and climbed the exterior stairs to Cecilia's apartment and knocked and was told to come in, which he did. Cecilia was in the chair by the window with a cup of tea. Titan walked to her, bypassed the chair entirely, and lay down across her feet with his chin on her left shoe and his eyes closed, not the alert, monitoring rest of a working dog, but the complete, unconditional rest of a dog that has decided it is safe to let go. And his tail moved once against the floor in the slow, certain beat that Marcus had learned to read in 7 years of working with him, as the single behavioral signal Titan reserved for the very specific determination that everything was the way it was supposed to be. Cecilia put her hand on the dog's back without looking away from the window. "He knows I've been looking for somewhere to land for a long time," she said. Marcus sat in the other chair and did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. The afternoon light came through the south-facing window and fell across Bernard's photograph, and across Titan's dark coat, and across Cecilia's white hair, and across the cup of tea, and outside the window the maple on the street had gone fully to leaf, and the sky over Cookeville was the particular blue that comes after a long rain has finally moved through. He had told her once, 2 months earlier, that he had not planned to stop at the station that day, that it had been Titan who stopped. She had looked at him with the clear, long-sighted patience of a woman who had been alive for 92 years and understood things that took that long to understand, and she had said, "That's how it usually works. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a dog moving in a straight line across a wet parking lot toward a woman who has been standing in the rain at the end of her options and sitting down beside her before anyone has given him permission." God does not always explain what he is doing at the moment he is doing it. He places a dog in a truck on a Tuesday afternoon and the dog stands up, and a man who has learned to trust what the dog already knows pulls over, and a woman who has been carrying everything alone for longer than is fair finds someone beside her left knee who will not leave. That is the whole instruction. That is the complete provision. There are Cecilia Marshes in bus stations and parking lots, and sidewalks in the rain in every city in this country. People who have been moved from the places they lived because someone calculated that their lives were less valuable than the margin. They do not ask for help. They hold a canvas bag and they stand in the rain and they wait for something they cannot name. Sometimes what they need is a dog who does not ask for permission, and a man who has learned to follow him. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that arrival is not the end of a journey, it is the beginning of belonging. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever been the person standing in the rain at the end of your options, or if you have ever been the person who stopped when you didn't have to. We would like to hear that. Your story may reach someone today who needs to know that stopping is still possible, that the world still contains people who do it. If you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the grace that moves through ordinary people who follow a dog's honest lead, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep you watchful enough to stop. Because somewhere today, someone is standing in the rain, waiting for exactly that.